A 12-year-old boy stood by the airport fence, sketching airplanes and dreaming of becoming a pilot. But in just minutes, his innocent hobby turned into a nightmare. A pilot spotted him, picked up the phone, and called the police, labeling the boy suspicious. Sirens flashed, officers closed in, and that child's dream was about to be crushed. But then his father arrived, and when the pilot discovered who this boy's dad really was, everything changed, and the regret hit harder than jet engine. Stay with me, because this story will shock you, inspire you, and leave you questioning how we treat others. Imagine this. You're 12 years old. The sun is shining. The air smells faintly of jet fuel, and the roar of engines shakes the ground beneath your feet. For Marcus, this wasn't noise, it was music. Airplanes weren't just machines in the sky. They were dreams with wings. He stood near the chain-link fence at the edge of the airport, his sneakers half buried in the dirt, a spiral notebook clutched in his hands. Every time a jet thundered down the runway, he scribbled furiously, sketching the wings, noting the airline's colors, even writing down the tail numbers. His eyes lit up with every takeoff, every landing. Marcus wasn't like most kids. While others his age were glued to video games or running around the neighborhood, Marcus had one passion: flying. His bedroom walls were covered with posters of jets, and his shelves overflowed with model airplanes. Whenever his dad had business near the airport, Marcus begged to tag along, just for a chance to stand by that fence and watch his heroes soar into the sky. But as he stood there that day, lost in the joy of his hobby, someone else was watching him too, a pilot. The pilot had just finished his pre-flight checks. He walked across the tarmac, his crisp uniform pressed, sunglasses reflecting the sun. At first, he didn't think much of the boy, but then his expression hardened. Instead of seeing a kid with a dream, he saw something else. Why is that boy standing there alone? The pilot thought. Why is he watching so closely? Taking notes? Could he be up to something? Instead of walking over and asking Marcus a simple question, the pilot pulled out his phone. He dialed. "Yeah," he said briskly. "There's a boy hanging around by the airport fence. Looks suspicious. He's writing things down. Could someone come check this out?" Suspicious. That one word changed everything. To Marcus, the world was exciting and full of possibility. To the pilot, Marcus suddenly became a threat. No one asked if he was just a kid sketching airplanes. No one stopped to see the wide-eyed curiosity on his face. A single assumption was enough to turn an innocent moment into something far more serious. Back at the police station, dispatchers radioed the call to nearby patrol officers. Report of suspicious activity by the perimeter fence. Male juvenile. Alone. Caller is a pilot. Says the boy is writing things down. The officers flipped on their lights and sirens. They didn't know what they were walking into, only that someone at the airport, a place where security is taken very seriously, thought there might be a problem. Meanwhile, Marcus had no idea what was coming. He crouched down by the fence, drawing the landing gear of a Boeing 737 as it touched down, rubber screeching against the runway. He smiled, whispering to himself, "One day, that's going to be me." But the sound of engines was soon replaced by another sound, far closer, far more intimidating. Sirens. Marcus's head jerked up. He squinted as two patrol cars sped toward him, their lights flashing red and blue. His notebook slipped from his hands. The officers pulled up quickly, dust swirling in the air. Their doors swung open, and heavy boots crunched against the gravel as they stepped out. Marcus froze. His heart began to pound. One officer raised a hand. "Hey, kid, what are you doing here?" Marcus stammered, his voice small. I'm just watching the planes, sir." The officer frowned. "Watching the planes? You writing something down?" "Yes, sir," Marcus said, holding up his notebook timidly. I like to draw them. I want to be a pilot one day." The officer glanced at his partner. The tension in their stance eased a little, but the situation wasn't over. The call had been made, and they had to investigate. Meanwhile, from across the tarmac, the pilot who made the call watched the scene unfold. Arms crossed, he stood with an air of self-importance, as if he had just prevented some disaster. To him, Marcus didn't look like a boy with dreams. He looked like a risk, And that assumption, born from nothing but fear and bias, was now dictating the course of a child's afternoon. Marcus bent down to pick up his notebook, his hands trembling. He opened it and showed the officers page after page of sketches. Planes, wings, clouds, even a control tower. Nothing dangerous. Nothing threatening. Just the innocent scribbles of a boy who loved aviation. The officers exchanged another glance. It was clear Marcus wasn't a threat, but still, they couldn't ignore the call. Procedure required them to document the incident, to report what they found. Marcus's chest tightened. He didn't understand why this was happening. Why did they think he was suspicious? Why did they look at him like he had done something wrong? He was just watching airplanes. The boy who only wanted to fly suddenly felt like a criminal. And that was a moment, the exact second, that the course of this day changed forever. A pilot assumption, a phone call, and a boy's dream colliding with suspicion. The police were here. The tension was rising, and Marcus's innocent afternoon by the fence was about to spiral into something much bigger. Because what Marcus didn't know was that someone very important was on their way. Someone who wasn't just a father, but a man with the authority to change everything about this situation. And when he arrived, the pilot who made that call would instantly regret what he had set into motion. The sound of jet engines had always been Marcus's escape. Each roar overhead filled his notebook with new sketches and new dreams. But that day, the sound of engines was drowned out by something far different. Sirens. 2 patrol cars swung around the corner. Lights flashing, sirens wailing like an alarm bell. The ground seemed to shake under their tires as they skidded to a stop by the airport fence. Marcus's pencil slipped from his hand. His notebook slid halfway into the dirt. His heart dropped into his stomach. He didn't understand. Why were the police here? Why were they coming toward him? The car doors opened with a heavy thunk. Out stepped 2 uniformed officers, their hands resting firmly on their belts, their eyes locked on Marcus. Their faces were serious, not angry, not cruel, but filled with the kind of authority that made a child feel instantly small. "Son," one officer called out, his voice firm but controlled. "What are you doing here?" Marcus's throat felt dry. He reached down slowly, picked up his notebook, and held it tight against his chest like a shield. I'm just watching the plane, sir," he stammered. His voice cracked with fear. I want to be a pilot one day." The officers stopped a few feet from him. They looked at each other. Neither saw a threat standing in front of them. They saw a boy in worn sneakers and a T-shirt. His wide eyes filled more with fear than anything else. But still, the call had been made. The report said suspicious activity near the airport fence. And when a call like that comes in, procedure leaves no room for assumptions. They had to investigate, even if it didn't feel right. One officer softened his voice slightly. "You been out here long? You live nearby?" Marcus nodded quickly. "My dad brought me. He's working. I just like drawing." He flipped open his notebook nervously and held it out, his hand trembling. The pages fluttered in the wind, revealing sketches of planes in different angles, clouds, and even little doodles of himself wearing a pilot's cap. The officers glanced down at the drawings. One of them let out the faintest sigh, as if to say, "This is nothing." But rules were rules, and they couldn't just walk away. From across the tarmac, the man who had started it all approached. The pilot. His uniform was sharp, his cap tilted just right, his sunglasses hiding his eyes but not his expression. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, his lips pressed into a self-satisfied line. He didn't wait for the officers to call him over. He strode up like he was the one in charge. "That's him," he said bluntly, tilting his head toward Marcus. "That's the kid I called about. He was loitering around, writing things down. You never know these days." Marcus's stomach twisted. He felt like someone had just branded him with a crime he didn't commit. One of the officers held up a hand, keeping the pilot at bay. "Sir, we've got this handled." But the pilot didn't back off. He stood there, shaking his head, muttering under his breath as though he had uncovered some great danger. To him, Marcus wasn't an innocent boy sketching airplanes. He was a problem. Marcus's eyes welled with tears. He turned back to the officers, desperation in his voice. "I wasn't hurting anyone," he pleaded. I just I just like watching airplanes. He clutched his notebook tighter, as though it was his last offense. The officers looked at each other again, their expressions conflicted. They knew what they were looking at. A harmless kid with a harmless dream. But the call forced them into the situation. A pilot had raised the alarm, and if they dismissed it without going through the motions, there could be consequences. One officer crouched slightly, trying to meet Marcus at eye level. "Look, son," he said in a calmer tone, "you're not in trouble. But you need to understand, when people see something they don't recognize, sometimes they overreact. We're just here to make sure everything's okay." Marcus nodded quickly, though his lip trembled. "I just want to see the planes. That's all. One day I'm going to fly one." Those words hung in the air. They were innocent, pure, filled with hope. Yet here he was, standing in front of flashing lights and police officers, as if he had done something wrong. The truth was clear to everyone there. Marcus wasn't dangerous. But still, the scene had been created, and the boy's dream had just turned into his scariest day yet. And while Marcus stood there, scared and confused, clutching his notebook of dreams, the man who had caused all of this, the pilot, continued to shake his head, blind to the truth right in front of him. For Marcus, that innocent afternoon of watching airplanes had been stolen. In its place was fear, suspicion, and the chilling feeling of being treated like a criminal for nothing more than having a dream. But what none of them realized was that this moment was far from over. Someone was about to arrive. Someone who would change the entire situation in an instant. And when he did, the pilot who had set all this in motion would find himself regretting the call more than he could ever imagine. The flashing police lights reflected in Marcus's teary eyes. His little hand still clutched the notebook, pages fluttering in the wind. He was trying to be brave, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Then, suddenly, another car pulled up near the scene. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop, its engine quiet compared to the roar of patrol cars and jets overhead. The door opened. Out stepped a tall man in a sharp suit, his tie perfectly knotted, a leather briefcase in one hand. His stride was purposeful, his presence commanding, and the moment his eyes landed on Marcus, all formality vanished. "Marcus," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the lot. Marcus's head snapped up. His fear broke instantly into relief. "Dad!" he cried, running straight into his father's arms. The officers, mid-question, paused. They hadn't expected this turn. The man held his son tightly, shielding him with an arm as though nothing else in the world mattered. Then, slowly, he turned to face the two officers. "Sir," one officer asked carefully, "is this your son?" "Yes," the man replied firmly. His voice carried both authority and frustration. "He is my son." He glanced around at the squad cars, the flashing lights, the stern faces. His jaw tightened. "Now, someone explain to me, what exactly is going on here?" The officers hesitated. They weren't sure how to answer. Before they could respond, another voice cut in. It was the pilot. He stepped forward confidently, his sunglasses catching the glare of the sun. To him, this was his moment to justify everything. "This boy," he said, pointing at Marcus, "was loitering around the airport fence, writing things down. I thought he looked suspicious. I was concerned he might be a threat." Marcus's father slowly turned to face the man. He studied him in silence for a long, heavy moment. Then he spoke. "A threat?" he repeated, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "He's a child. My child. He was standing here, sketching planes, something he's dreamed of flying one day. And for that, you call the police?" The air grew heavy. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Marcus clung to his father's side, still trembling. The pilot's confidence wavered. He straightened his cap, his defensive tone cracking just slightly. "Look, I was just trying to protect the airport. You never know these days. Better safe than sorry." But Marcus's father didn't flinch. His eyes bore into the man's. "Protect the airport?" he said firmly. "From what? From a boy with a notebook? From a child standing outside the fence, harmlessly admiring the very planes you fly?" His words were precise, deliberate, each one striking like a hammer. The pilot shifted on his feet. It wasn't personal. I was just doing my duty as a pilot. We're trained to report anything unusual. A kid hanging around, writing things down. It didn't look right. Now, Marcus's father's voice dropped lower, quieter, but somehow even more commanding. What didn't look right? His notebook? His skin? Or simply the fact that you assumed the worst without stopping to ask the simplest question, why are you here? The silence that followed was deafening. The officers avoided eye contact, staring at the ground. The pilot's jaw tightened, but he had no immediate reply. Marcus looked up at his dad, confusion still written across his face. "Dad, I wasn't doing anything wrong. I just wanted to see the planes," he whispered. "I know, son," his father said softly, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Then his eyes locked back onto the pilot. His tone shifted, no longer just a father defending his son, but a man about to reveal who he truly was. "I think," he said steadily, "it's time you understood who you're dealing with." He set down his briefcase, opened it, and pulled out a leather wallet. From it, he withdrew an official identification badge, silver and blue, with an emblem that carried weight. He held it up, letting the sunlight catch it. "My name," he said, pausing for effect, "is David Carter, Regional Administrator, Federal Aviation Administration." The words dropped like thunder. The officers' eyes widened instantly. Their posture shifted, snapping into respect. One even straightened his belt instinctively. The FAA wasn't just another agency. The FAA Administrator in charge of the region had authority over airports, pilots, safety regulations, everything connected to aviation. And in this case, he had authority over this pilot. The pilot's face drained of color. His smirk evaporated, his shoulders stiffening as the weight of realization sank in. He hadn't just called the police on an innocent boy. He had called the police on the son of the man who oversaw his very profession. David Carter tucked the badge back into his suit jacket, his eyes never leaving the pilot. "You call my son a threat, a 12-year-old boy. And for what? For standing near a fence with a pencil and a notebook?" The pilot opened his mouth, then shut it again. The confidence, the swagger, it was gone. He was left standing there exposed, caught in the shadow of the man whose respect and approval his career ultimately depended on. Marcus's father turned back toward the officers. His tone softened slightly. "Officers, I know you're just doing your jobs. You followed the call as you were required to. But let's be clear, this never should have happened." They nodded quickly, both relieved and uneasy. Then, facing the pilot one final time, David Carter said with quiet intensity, "Next time you see a child with a dream, try not to mistake it for a threat." And in that instant, the entire atmosphere shifted. The boy who had been treated like a suspect was now the son of the most powerful man in the room. And the pilot, the one who had judged him so quickly, was left with nothing but the sting of regret. "I'm David Carter," the man said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out a black leather wallet, and flipped it open. Inside gleamed an official badge and ID card. "I'm the Regional Administrator for the Federal Aviation Administration." The air around them seemed to freeze. The two officers straightened instantly. Their eyes widened with recognition. This wasn't just a concerned parent. They were standing in front of one of the highest-ranking officials in aviation, a man whose authority touched every aspect of the airport they were standing on. And then there was the pilot. His confident smirk, the self-satisfied air he'd carried since making the call. It crumbled in an instant. His jaw slackened, his posture stiffened. Suddenly, he wasn't the authority in this situation. He wasn't the protector. He was the one who had made a mistake. A very big one. David Carter let the weight of his words sink in. Then he spoke again, his tone steady but sharp, like steel wrapped in velvet. "Do you understand," he said slowly, "the message you sent by calling the police on my son?" The pilot swallowed hard, but no words came out. David's eyes narrowed. A boy standing near an airport fence with a notebook in his hand is not a criminal. He is a dreamer. He is curious. He is the future of aviation. But instead of encouraging that, you chose fear. You chose suspicion. You tried to scare him away from the very thing that inspires him. His words struck like thunder. The officers shifted uneasily. They hadn't been the ones who made the call, but they knew what he said was true. One of them bent slightly, crouching down to Marcus's level. "Son," the officer said gently, his voice much softer now, "you're not in any trouble. We believe you. You didn't do anything wrong." Marcus clutched his notebook tighter. For the first time since the patrol cars had arrived, a tiny spark of relief flickered in his eyes. David placed a hand firmly on his son's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and empowering. He looked directly into Marcus's eyes. "Marcus," he said, his tone now warm, fatherly, "remember this moment. Not everyone will see your potential right away. Some people will judge you without knowing who you are. But don't you ever let anyone's ignorance stop you from reaching for the sky." Marcus's lips trembled. He nodded slowly. His dad's words sank deeper than anything else. They weren't just reassurance. They were a promise that his dream was still alive. The pilot, red-faced and sweating, finally found his voice. I didn't know who you were," he stammered. "If I had known—" David turned to him sharply, cutting him off. "And that's the problem," he said firmly. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat my son with respect. He didn't need me to be standing here for you to see that he's a child with a dream. But instead of trying to understand him, you assumed the worst. You let your bias control your judgment." The pilot's face burned. He opened his mouth, but the words stuck in his throat. David stepped closer, lowering his voice, making sure every word landed. "Let me be clear. When you put on that uniform, you carry responsibility, not just for your passengers, not just for the aircraft you fly, but for the values of aviation itself. And what you did today doesn't honor those values. It shames them." The silence was deafening. The only sound was the distant roar of a jet taking off, climbing into the sky, exactly where Marcus dreamed of being. The officers both looked down, clearly humbled by what they had witnessed. The one still crouched near Marcus gave him a small nod, as if to say, "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Marcus looked back up at his dad. His father's words gave him courage. He clutched his notebook to his chest like a badge of honor, no longer just a collection of sketches, but a symbol of his dream, a dream that no amount of suspicion could erase. David straightened his jacket, his authority radiating through every movement. "This ends here," he declared, his eyes sweeping over the scene. "My son is not a threat. He never was. And I won't allow anyone to treat him as if he is, simply because they fail to see who he truly is." The pilot said nothing. His silence was louder than any excuse he could have given. And in that moment, the truth was undeniable. The boy who had been seen as suspicious was actually a child filled with potential. The man who had been seen as a protector was the one exposed for his prejudice. And the father who had arrived quietly had revealed himself as a force that could not be ignored, because sometimes it only takes a single truth to change everything. The air around the airport fence had shifted. The flashing police lights no longer felt threatening, but the silence that followed was thick with shame. The pilot, who only minutes earlier had stood with his arms crossed and his chin high, now looked like a man crushed beneath the weight of his own actions. He shifted uncomfortably, his shoes grinding against the gravel. His posture sagged, and his sunglasses no longer made him look authoritative. They only made him look like he was hiding. He cleared his throat, but his voice cracked as he spoke. I'm sorry." The words barely left his lips. They hung in the air, weak, hollow, and unconvincing. David Carter's expression didn't change. His calm but commanding presence held steady. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said firmly. "Not me. You don't owe me an apology." He stepped aside just slightly, resting a hand on Marcus's shoulder and guiding his son forward. "You owe him one." The pilot blinked, his face burning with embarrassment. He had spent years commanding cockpits, leading crews, carrying himself with confidence. Yet here he was, humbled by the quiet dignity of a 12-year-old boy holding nothing more than a notebook. Turning stiffly, the pilot bent down ever so slightly, his voice low and uneasy. "I'm sorry, kid. I shouldn't have called the police on you." Marcus's big brown eyes stared up at him. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The boy had been through enough in the last half hour. Fear, confusion, humiliation. But then, with the strength that only a child's honesty can bring, Marcus gave a small nod. "Okay," he said softly. His voice trembled, but it carried more weight than the pilot's apology ever could. The pilot straightened quickly, eager to leave. His pride was in pieces, scattered across the gravel beneath his feet. As he walked away, his uniform suddenly didn't feel like armor. It felt like a reminder of the mistake he'd made. Each step back toward his plane carried the sting of regret, the heavy knowledge that he had humiliated himself not just in front of officers, but in front of the very man who held authority over his profession. The officers, now certain the situation was under control, quietly excused themselves. They nodded respectfully to David and offered a kind smile to Marcus before heading back to their cars. The flashing lights dimmed into the distance, leaving behind only the sound of jets and the faint hum of the runway. And then it was just father and son. David crouched down, eye level with Marcus, his firm expression softening into one of love and reassurance. He reached out and gently placed both hands on his son's shoulders. "Marcus," he began, his voice steady, "sometimes people are going to doubt you, not because of what you've done, but because of who you are. They'll look at you and see their own fears, their own assumptions. They'll try to make you feel small." He paused, brushing a tear from his son's cheek. "But you can't let that stop you. You have something they don't. You have dreams. You have determination. And one day, you're going to be flying those planes you've been sketching. No one can take that away from you." Marcus's trembling lips curved into the faintest smile. He clutched his notebook tighter, almost hugging it against his chest. "Do you really think so, Dad?" David's eyes softened. "I don't just think so. I know so." The boy nodded, his fear slowly giving way to pride. He had been seen as suspicious, judged unfairly, treated as if his dreams were dangerous. But here, in this moment, he knew the truth. He wasn't alone. His father not only believed in him, but had stood up for him in the face of prejudice. The wind blew gently, flipping the corner of Marcus's notebook. On the page was a sketch of a jet lifting off into the clouds. He looked at it and smiled wider this time, imagining himself in the cockpit. Behind them, the pilot walked stiffly toward his aircraft. Every step echoed with the weight of his mistake. He replayed the scene in his mind. The call, the flashing lights, the child's frightened face, and the powerful reveal of who that child's father truly was. What had started as him feeling like a vigilant protector had ended in humiliation, because prejudice doesn't just harm the innocent. It exposes the one who carries it. For the pilot, the lesson was bitter but clear. Never judge someone without knowing their story. He had allowed fear and bias to dictate his actions, and in doing so, he had not only embarrassed himself, but nearly tarnished his reputation in front of the very man who oversaw his career. And for Marcus, the lesson was different, but just as important. Dreams are stronger than doubt. Even when the world misjudges you, even when fear tries to dim your light, your vision for the future can't be stolen. As David and Marcus walked back toward their car, the boy held his father's hand tightly, his notebook pressed under his arm. The fear was still fresh, but so was something else, pride. Pride in who he was, pride in who he wanted to become. And as for the pilot, he carried his regret onto that plane, a regret that would follow him for years. Because when you judge someone unfairly, especially a child with nothing but hope in his heart, that mistake doesn't just disappear. It lingers, it teaches, and it reminds you the cost of seeing people through the lens of fear instead of possibility. Because the truth is simple. When you crush someone's dream, you don't just hurt them, you diminish yourself. And for that pilot, the lesson came too late. But it came hard. Marcus, however, walked away taller that day, not because the world had suddenly become fairer, but because he had a father who reminded him that the sky was still his to claim. And one day, when he sat in the cockpit of a jet soaring above the clouds, he would remember this moment, not as the day his dream was threatened, but as the day it was made unshakable. Because sometimes, the hardest lessons bring the strongest wings. This story is a powerful reminder that quick judgments can destroy dreams, but standing up for what's right can change everything. Marcus's father showed us that respect and fairness must always come before prejudice. So, what do you think? Was a pilot apology enough? Or should there have been consequences? Let me know in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories that will open your eyes and move your heart. Until next time, keep dreaming big and never let anyone clip your wings.